Welcome to session 7 of our study of archaeology in the Bible. We've finally reached the New Testament period, and so we will be beginning with the gospel accounts and the life of Christ. Now, as has been our custom, we'll start off with some of the problems of the text. And an initial problem is the governorship of Quirinius. This comes to us from the second chapter of Luke, the first 3 verses. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all went to be registered, each to his own town. So, what is our problem? Well, we have a historical record of Quirinius being governor of Syria. And we also have record that he conducted a census during his governorship. But all of this is dated to the year 6 AD. And that's well after the time frame when we project that Jesus would have been born. And the reason we know that is because Herod the Great was king at the time of Jesus' birth. And we do know that Herod died at some point between about 4 and 1 BC. So we've got a real mismatch here in the dates. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, was Luke incorrect in this time frame and dating? Well, we do know that Publius Sulpicius Quirinius was a noteworthy public figure. He was a very successful military general. And the archaeology tells us a little something about him. We have here an inscription of Aemilius Secundus, who was an officer who served under Quirinius when he was governor of Syria. And this particular tablet lists the honors of Aemilius Secundus. And one of the interesting honors it lists here is that Secundus administered the census in the district of Apamea, but it doesn't give us a specific date. The way we come up with that date is a historian named Josephus records the fact that Quirinius administered a census in Syria in the year 6 AD. We also have another tablet inscription. This is called the Inscriptiones Latinae Selectae number 9502. And it was the base for a statue dedication for an officer named Sergius Fronto, who served under Quirinius in Turkey. The noteworthy thing on this particular inscription is it names Quirinius as a duumvir, which is a term for being like a co-leader. It would have been a political official who actually held power with another. So that does give you some sense that there were times when Quirinius shared power with others. And then we also have this, which is called the Tivoli inscription. It is a funerary inscription for an unnamed Roman official. So you can see there it's very clearly inscribed, but the name is missing. And that's somewhat unfortunate because this unnamed Roman official is listed as having served as the governor of Syria twice, which would be a very interesting case if Quirinius served as governor of Syria in 6 AD and then possibly served at a time previous to that. So this, at least puts some possibilities forward, but really doesn't prove anything to us. But obviously, someone, according to this inscription, was the governor of Syria twice. And then another thing, just going straight from the biblical text, that word governorship in Luke chapter 2, it's translated governorship, but hegemonio really means to exercise authority. So it doesn't necessarily mean you are specifically the governor. It's also a word that's used in terms of military command and so forth. And we know that Quirinius was a military general, so it is possible that he could have held some sort of military command at that time frame as well. It's not unheard of for military officials to oversee a census. So not really any definitive answers there, but lots of questions, and it's definitely not a clear-cut fail either. So we move on from the governorship of Quirinius to a little bit more deep discussion of Luke himself in terms of his accuracy as a historian. One thing that is very different about Luke than pretty much any of the other biblical writers, especially in the New Testament, Luke sets out to write history. He even tells us that in the beginning of the book of Luke. So the first 4 verses of Luke chapter 1, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. So Luke is basically putting this out there and saying, I've talked to eyewitnesses, I've looked into the sources, and I've written everything I found out down so that you would have a history. So let's talk a little bit about Luke the historian. Really, Luke's is the only gospel that gives us a kind of secular time frame. It gives us timing in terms of both the Roman history and the Jewish history. He tells us officials who were in power from the Roman side. He tells us the various officials on the Jewish side, particularly the high priest and some of the other leadership. He also writes in a fashion that is very similar to the other contemporary histories of his day, both in Greek and Latin. He gives us the narrative of events, and interspersed throughout that narrative, he will have speeches that are given by his main characters that kind of move the historical narrative along. So this would have been a very common means of writing history in his time frame. Now, we do kind of have a little bit of a ding with Luke as a historian because of the difficulty with Quirinius in the timing of Christ's birth narrative, but that's also not necessarily definitively a false thing at this point. Another thing we have is Luke on and on has proven himself to be a master of the technical terminology. We know that he was a physician, and so he does give us some good information from essentially a medical or a sense like that. But we also see that he is very careful in his use of titles. For example, when he refers to Herod Antipas, he calls him the Tetrarch instead of calling him king, because Tetrarch was the Roman term for Antipas. And so Luke and Matthew get that correct. Also in Luke chapter 3, when he starts talking about the beginnings of the ministry of Christ, he names off the governor, he names off the emperor, he gives all the names, and they're all personalities that are correct for that time frame. Really, the good name that Luke gets for being a historian is mainly, while his gospel account is definitely positive towards that, the big aspect of his reputation comes from the writing of the book of Acts, and we will actually discuss that in our next session. So beyond Quirinius and Luke, let's talk about the man who it is all about, Jesus Christ, historical figure. There have been some points in the past, and there are even still a few people to this day among scholars who doubt that there ever existed a historical Jesus. There's even a historical Jesus movement where they're trying to kind of rebuild or kind of construct what the historical Jesus would have been like. But interestingly enough, historian and non-Christian Will Durant once said many years ago that if historians use the philosophy of scholars who claim that Jesus did not exist, if they use that consistently, then most of the historical figures that we study about would need to be completely discarded. So there definitely is a double standard in terms of the level of proof that some people require from the Bible versus what they require from other sources. Now, you've always wondered, what does Jesus look like? Well, here he is. This is a computer-generated representation of what Jesus might have looked like. It was made using artificial intelligence algorithms, which tells you that it must be right. And I got it off the internet, which is another reason why it must be right. But let's look at this. What do we really know about Jesus? Well, our primary source is the Bible itself. That's where we really get the main aspect of our knowledge, and especially the detail of the life of Christ, of kind of his outlook and those type of goings on. That's in the Gospels, and then later New Testament writings will all reference back to the life of Christ. However, because the scholars are always going to doubt the religious text, this primary source is going to be suspect. So what do we have that is outside of the Bible? Let's look at that. We have the Roman historian Tacitus, who was writing at about the time 116, 117 AD. Tacitus was not a fan of Christians. It comes through very clearly in his writing, but in this one particular point, in one of Tacitus's histories, he mentions the founder of this name, Christus, had been executed in the reign of Tiberius by the procurator Pontius Pilate. So this is a mention of Jesus outside of the Bible, within about 70 to 80 years of the time frame of his crucifixion. Now, something that's kind of interesting to note here is Tacitus calls Pontius Pilate a procurator, when in actuality we know from contemporary accounts that that is not the correct term. The correct term, or the correct title for Pilate, would have been prefect. And that is the title that Luke uses, and the title that has been borne out through the archaeology as being correct. Also, we have mention of Christ in the writings of Josephus, who was a Jewish historian who after 70 A.D. Was a writer for the Romans. He mentions Jesus twice. And one of those mentions it's pretty controversial, because there is an aspect to it where he mentions Jesus and his crucifixion, but he basically says, Jesus was a righteous man and the Son of God. And there are a lot of scholars who doubt that Josephus, a devout Jew, would have put that in his history. So they kind of doubt that, and they assume that maybe a Christian scribe who was copying this may have inserted that in later on. It's possible. It is kind of doubtful that Josephus would have called Christ the Son of God. but nonetheless, most scholars believe that he did mention Jesus. Now, the other reference that we see in the writing of Josephus mentions Jesus as the brother of James, and he talks about the trial by the Sanhedrin of James in Jerusalem. Now, another writer who is near contemporary is Lucian of Samosata. He lived about 115 to 200 AD. He mentions Jesus kind of indirectly in a play that he wrote. It's a Greek satire called The Passing of Peregrinus, and he refers to Jesus as the man who was crucified in Palestine because he introduced this new cult into the world. And it's not just Gentiles who mention Jesus. There is also at least one rabbinical writing of this time that we find in the Babylonian Talmud in Sanhedrin 43a that says, on the eve of Passover, they hanged Yeshu HaNosri, and HaNosri would mean of Nazareth, because he has practiced magic and enticed and led Israel astray. So even if you don't want to take the Bible at face value, there are enough other references to Jesus to really account for his historical existence. So we move from the problems to our historical synchronisms. What are some aspects of history and archaeology that kind of cross over and coincide? Well, we have the Pilate inscription. For a very great deal of time, there was no other mention of Pontius Pilate outside of the Bible. So, of course, those skeptical scholars are going to say, well, then this is just a figure who was made up, who was formulated to kind of advance the story and to kind of make the crucifixion narrative work. However, as is the case in many of these other types of assertions, in 1961, a stone was uncovered in excavations of Caesarea Maritima on the coast of the Mediterranean that gave some external evidence of Pontius Pilate. The stone was found by Italian archaeologists who were excavating in the city's theater. And just like our Tel Dan fragment that we talked about a session or two ago, this stone had also been repurposed. It was in use as a step for the stairs of the theater, but it had previously been an inscription dedicating a public building, and visible on this, as you can see in the photograph, we see Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. That's fairly evident. Now, it's hard to read some of the other aspects of it. It does say something about the dedication of a Tiberium, and no one is really quite sure what a Tiberium is. There are a lot of guesses. We know that the Romans were notorious for the cult of emperor worship, and Tiberius was the emperor at the time that Pontius Pilate was the prefect. So this may have been the dedication of some sort of public building or even a temple to Tiberius. This is really the only contemporary evidence we have for Pilate. He gets mentioned a lot in extra-biblical sources, but all those extra-biblical sources are referring back to the Bible. So this was a very important thing to find this inscription that is dated to that same general time frame. Now, we also have the Caiaphas ossuary. Let's talk a little bit about what an ossuary is. An ossuary is a bone box. It's usually carved out of limestone, and it's generally a fairly short time period in history when these were used in Israel. It was mainly between about 100 BC and 70 AD in the fall of Jerusalem. These ossuaries were particularly popular among the upper class, the wealthy and well-connected in Jerusalem. Now, the Jewish burial customs of the time would involve taking the body and putting it in a rock cut, a tomb that's been cut out of stone. You treat the body with spices and you lay it out on a platform inside this tomb. You would seal up the tomb, and then the body would decompose after a certain period of time of decomposition. The bones would be gathered up and they would either be put in like an alcove in the tomb, or if this was a particularly wealthy family, they might have had an ossuary made and they would put the bones in the ossuary. And what you would find is these ossuaries, the name of the individual in the ossuary would be inscribed by the eldest son. Although it's quite common, because these things were very expensive and so forth, to find ossuaries with the bones of multiple individuals in them. So what does one of these things look like? Well, this is the Caiaphas ossuary. In 1990, a bulldozer uncovered the roof of a tomb just outside of Jerusalem that contained 4 ossuaries. In one of the ossuaries, inscribed on the side and the back, was Joseph, son of Caiaphas. Inside that ossuary were the bones of 6 different individuals, but one of them is believed to be a man, or at least estimated to be a man of about 60. And we know, again, from the historian Josephus, that the high priest Caiaphas in the time of Christ, his given name was Joseph, and Caiaphas was the family name. It was the name of his father. So basically, from the time frame, from the ornateness of the ossuary and the inscription, just about most scholars will agree that this is indeed the high priest who's mentioned in the Gospels. So that's a nice little synchronism that operates here. And this gives us a little bit closer look at the inscription itself. It's kind of interesting that in all of these ossuaries, what you find is very, very high quality workmanship, very ornate carving and decoration. But in almost every case, the inscription of the name, because it would be done by normally the eldest son, is usually pretty rough. Sometimes hard to believe or hard to read, just because you've got someone who is not used to working with the stone. So let's move from the synchronisms to some of our cultural specificities, some aspects of culture that we found in the archaeology that seem to ring true with aspects of the biblical account. First, let's talk about the Census papyrus. The requirement that we see especially in the book of Luke, for Joseph to have to return to Bethlehem to be registered for the census, that has often been dismissed by critics as something of a literary device, just to make the story work and to make the story match this prophecy. Joseph's in Nazareth, but somehow or another the Messiah has to be born in Bethlehem. So how do we get him to Bethlehem? Oh, we'll have this census. And of course, we look at these things and bear in mind we're looking through our 21st century lens, and we say, well, that's not the way we do a census. That doesn't make any sense. And so ends up being a great deal of doubt. Well, what we have here is a papyrus found in Egypt in 1907. It's called the Edict of Vibius Maximus. And this papyrus reports in Greek, because that was kind of the universal language at that time, especially in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. The papyrus reports that Gaius Vibius Maximus, prefect of Egypt, orders all persons absent from their homes to return to their own place in order to be registered in the census. And with some of the other aspects to this, they've been able to date this edict pretty closely to 104 AD. So again, we're talking within, about 100 years of the time frame of Christ. So again, is this definitive proof? No, but it does give you a feel for this aspect of returning to your home or your place of residence in order to be registered. Now, we also have a warning against tomb robbing. This is called the Nazareth inscription. A common criticism of the resurrection, and that's for those who even believe that Jesus existed at all, is that the disciples just stole Jesus's body from the tomb to leave it open and empty, and then claimed that he had risen from the dead. That's even something that the Jewish religious leaders made the accusation on. Well, we have an inscription that was acquired in 1878 that seems to talk to this very issue. So this is the Nazareth inscription. It is a stone inscription that shows an edict of Caesar. Doesn't tell us which Caesar. From the lettering style and everything else, most scholars believe it was probably the Emperor Claudius or Tiberius. But this particular inscription makes it a capital crime to disturb a tomb. The style of the lettering puts the inscription sometime between about 50 BC and 50 AD, so right dead in the middle of our New Testament period. It's called the Nazareth inscription because the dealer or the shipper who it was bought from in France had noted that it had been shipped from Nazareth. So that's why it's considered to be from that area. It's currently in the Louvre. Where this gets a little controversial, I guess, in 2019, an analysis was made of the marble of the inscription, and it was found that this marble composition is a match to marble from a quarry on the Greek island of Kos. And once this became known, there's also a contemporary problem that is known of desecration of the tomb of a high official on Kos in the 30s BC. So a lot of scholars have said, well, this has nothing to do with the desecration or the removal of a body from the tomb of Christ. This has to do with this particular issue that happened in Greece. So it is a little bit problematic. It is it is possible that could be the case. The other thing that some people will tell you is just because it is Greek marble doesn't mean that it still couldn't have come from Judea. There are several examples of marble imported into Judea, even from this particular island of Kos. So this is again one of those that it's an interesting little cultural aspect. It's not a slam dunk. There's some question to it, and we have to be very conscious of the fact that we can't force artifacts to fit what we want them to be. All right, so let's finish out our discussion of culture with some more information about crucifixion, because this is really kind of a key here. Historically speaking, crucifixion has been attributed to the Phoenicians, to the Persians, and the Assyrians. Lots of different questions about who came up with this first, but the Romans took it to the next level. It was a punishment that was considered so severe and so shameful that Roman law did not allow citizens to be crucified. So it was only non-citizens who would be punished in this manner. It was typically used in regards to treason or rebellion or banditry. A noteworthy example is the crucifixion of 6,000 slaves along the Appian Way in Italy after the failed slave rebellion of Spartacus in 71 BC. So this is something that was definitely a tool of the Roman state. Well, in 1968, Israeli workmen accidentally broke through into a stone burial chamber in northeast Jerusalem, and they found several tombs with multiple ossuaries. One of the ossuaries that was found in the first tomb contained the bones of a young child and also of a man in his mid-20s. The ossuary was inscribed Yehohanan, son of Hakal. And part of this particular bone set had the heel bone of the young man, and it had a bent nail that's about 4.5 inches long driven through it, and there were still pieces of olive wood attached to the bone. There really wasn't any sign of nails being used in the hands or the wrists of this individual, but definitely this nail has gone through the heel, and there is the evidence of the wood. It's kind of interesting that a lot of scholars will tell you that if the nail hadn't bent when it was being driven in, it probably would have just been removed and reused, and it would have been there's no way they would have recognized this as a victim of crucifixion. So this was a big deal because it was the first known physical evidence, first known archaeological evidence of crucifixion. It's written about in a great deal of areas, but they'd never found physical evidence of it. Now, since that time frame, a second bone set that shows clear evidence of crucifixion was discovered in Italy in 2007. So again, a very key cultural specificity there that lends itself to the biblical account. So we look at our references. We talked a little bit about this last session. Lost Treasures of the Bible is a great reference, has great pictures, kind of a bite-sized sort of thing. You can look up just the kind of things you're interested in. So highly recommend that. We have Luke, Historian and Theologian by Howard Marshall. This one's a little bit more of a dense read. It's the sort of thing you would just sort of reference for specific things, but you certainly wouldn't sit down next to a fire and read it on a winter's evening. And then finally, Archaeology and the New Testament by John McCrae. This is a little bit more of a popularly written book for archaeology in the New Testament. It's also not terribly expensive, and you can normally find it used. So another good overall reference if you find that that's something that you're looking for. Now, next session, we will be finishing out the biblical text. We'll be discussing the book of Acts and also the writings and epistles of Paul.